Delphi.
Greek antiquity considered Delphi, nestled on the southern slopes of Mount Parnassus, to be the navel of the world. The root of the name is associated with the womb and suggests an older, deeper affinity with the goddess Gaia, Mother Earth. Here, in the temple of the beardless sun god Apollo, lord of prophecy, the oracles of Delphi, priestesses known as the Pythia, from the term Python, were consulted and their responses deliberated. The most dramatic instance must have been when terrified Greeks feared for the very future existence of their world, when they discovered the largest expeditionary force ever heard of, some 2 million Persians and a naval fleet of 1,200 ships led by Xerxes the Great heading for Athens. For the Greeks, this must have felt like their Armageddon. That the oracles were sometimes cryptic must have made the business of interpreting anything of national importance intensely quarrelsome. Legend has it that the oracle had foretold of a Spartan king having to forfeit his life in the coming conflict, or their great city would fall to the Persians.
People of Sparta, either your city is destroyed by the Persians or it is not, and Lacedaemon will mourn a dead king of the Heraclid line. For the might of bulls and lions will not stay the enemy in battle. He has Zeus's might, and I say that he will not stop until he has destroyed one of these two.
King Leonidas, the Lion of Sparta, took this as his calling. Assembling 300 comrades in arms, he fearlessly marched into immortality at Thermopylae. The authenticity of this oracle, however, is in dispute. The onus was always upon correct and sensible interpretation. Despite some equivocation of the Delphic priestesses, their integrity was sacrosanct, so venerated was the institution. It is difficult to doubt that the more opaque oracles were artfully spun by wiliest of the politicians. However, when asked, "Is anyone wiser than Socrates?" there was no equivocation. The revered priestess declared that no man was wiser than Socrates of Athens, a rigorous skeptic and renowned gadfly. Inspired by this proclamation and the Delphic axiom "Know thyself," Socrates discovered that thyself was in fact a knower of nothing at all. He then proceeded to discover if others knew any more than he, the humble philosopher. And after some skillful interrogation of all who were willing, and many a bruised ego, discovered not one Athenian who could justly claim to having the greater knowledge. Socrates concluded that he was indeed the wisest man, simply because he knew that he knew nothing, while others conceitedly deluded themselves. Understandably, this rankled the leadership, much to the satisfaction of Athenian society's disaffected, as did his lackluster reverence for the capricious deities of the Greek pantheon. After some violent political turmoil in Athens, patience with Socrates finally ran out, and the wisest of all men was sentenced to death by a jury of 500 randomly selected men, despite his mesmerizing defense, according to his gifted disciple Plato, and the flattering endorsement of the oracle herself. The swatting of the gadfly was also a swipe at the respectability of the oracle and the Delphic institution, whose authority was possibly fatally undermined by politicians and men with vested interests. Before his death, Socrates comforted his inconsolable friends and disciples with his cherished imaginings of the hereafter.
Moreover, they have sanctuaries and temples of the gods, in which the gods dwell in very truth. They hear the voices and oracles of the gods, and see them in visions, and have intercourse with them face to face, and they see the sun and moon and stars as they really are. And in other matters, their happiness is of a piece with this.
It is said that some years later, Alexander of Macedon manhandled one Delphic priestess by the hair until she eventually conceded that he was unconquerable. Whether historically accurate or not, this alleged indelicate treatment of a priestess heralded a growing chauvinistic mood of irreverence. Even so, historians agree that Alexander the Great did indeed die unconquered.
Rome.
During episodes of distress such as war, crop failure, and pestilence, there were periods of persecution for women involved with mystery cults operating outside the officially sanctioned religions of ancient Rome. This is particularly true with regard to the practice of veneficium, a term denoting both poisoning and bewitching.
The word venenum is derived, according to Valda, from Venus and means a love potion. It has three meanings from actual usage: remedy, poison, and magic drug or abortive. The exact meaning is frequently determined by the qualifying adjective bonum or malum. Veneficium means poisoning and practicing sorcery, while veneficus or venefica was applied to a poisoner or maker of drugs.
In 186 BC, a broad and thorough countrywide investigation condemned 2,000 suspects for criminal involvement in the cult of Bacchus, especially for crimes of poisoning. This didn't put an end to the matter, and just a few years later, a particularly disastrous spell of pestilence fanned the embers of suspicion. Old rumors re-emerged regarding the widespread use of poisoning after the death of several high-ranking officials and other men of some standing. Another intensive investigation was ordered by the state, resulting in the trial of a consul's wife for murder, but in a rather more classical theme, that of the ruthlessly ambitious mother advancing the political career of her son by any means, including poisoning. She was executed on circumstantial evidence along with 3,000 others.
We see that women were most addicted to poisoning, but it seems not improbable that this charge was frequently brought against them without sufficient evidence of their guilt, like that of witchcraft in Europe in the Middle Ages. They were condemned to death for this crime in seasons of pestilence, when the popular mind is always in an excited state and ready to attribute the calamities which they suffer to the arts of evil-disposed persons.
It is problematic to conflate these cases with the notion of witchcraft per se in the Middle Ages, but there are similarities. Given the horrors of the Colosseum, it seems surprising the state was so squeamish with regard to Bacchanalia, unless it was considered subversive. Other than the debauchery and the violence meted out to busybodies and reluctant participants, the Roman historian Livy hints that there may have been an oracular facet to the rituals.
It was, as Livy says, a principle of the society to hold every ordinance of God and nature in contempt. Men, as if seized by fits of madness and under great convulsions, gave oracles, and the matrons, dressed as Bacchae, with dishevelled hair and burning torches in their hands, ran down to the Tiber and plunged their torches into the water. The torches, however, containing sulphur and chalk, were not extinguished.
In the very latter stages of the cult, young men were preferred for initiation, being more easily encouraged into licentiousness. These eyewitness accounts accentuated the misandry of the frenzied violence unleashed during the rituals, accounts that bear an uncanny resemblance to the plot of the Athenian playwright Euripides' gruesome depiction of King Pentheus's murder by the female devotees of Dionysus, the Bacchae, who, led by the king's maniacal mother, tore him limb from limb for trying to suppress the cult. Inevitably, the state came down hard on such practices with a thorough purging, a counter-orgy of terror, torture, and execution. The Roman Empire retained a residue of female divinity in the guise of the much purified Vestal Virgins. The role of these women as priestesses, however, appears sanitized and trivialized, a shadow of the pivotal role of the Pythia in classical Greece. The Pythia continued to exert some influence upon the Roman world as well, and seems to have been allowed to coexist, albeit safely outside of Italy. Generally speaking, the role of women in Roman public life looked increasingly insignificant. Occasionally, a Roman emperor would look whimsically upon what remained of the cultural glory of the Delphic era, until the troubled Emperor Nero plundered 500 statues from the vicinity with which to decorate Rome in a crass act of cultural rape. Apparently, when the oracle told the visiting Nero that his presence here in the Temple of Apollo offended the gods because of his supposed crime of matricide, he ordered the priestess buried alive. This represented a low point for matriarchal influence in Western Europe. Coming only a few years after Boudica, the warrior queen of the Iceni tribe of Britain gave the Roman Empire the kind of scare the likes of which it hadn't seen since Spartacus humiliated the Roman army in the Third Servile War. It was bad enough for Roman pride that Spartacus was a slave, but at least he was a male adversary. As Christianity gained a precarious toehold within the Roman world prior to Constantine, there were quite lengthy periods of tolerance interjected with outbreaks of savage persecution. Classical scholars claim the Emperor Diocletian, mindful of the Christian backlash, dispatched a soothsayer to Didyma in present-day Turkey to consult the oracle of Apollo, who replied as an enemy of God, thus endorsing the storming of God's temple and the greatest onslaught against Christians in Rome's history. Emperor Constantine, the Christian convert, suggests that the purge was instigated when the pagan Pythonesses complained that the Christians were affecting the accuracy of their prophecies. This incident may partially account for the bad blood between the different creeds. Scripture makes it clear.
A man or woman in whom there is a pythonical or divining spirit, dying let them die. They shall stone them, their blood be upon them. Leviticus chapter 20, verse 27.
Christendom.
Christendom took its lead from the book of Genesis, which went on the offensive from the very beginning. Eve's consultation with the serpent, her tasting the fruit of knowledge, and her subsequent demise constitutes an archetype that is too close to the Pythonic cult to simply ignore. Whatever the subsequent efforts to render Genesis politically correct and the hermeneutic attempts to worm out of such an obvious interpretation, the idea that any woman should gain the upper hand over her male mate in terms of wisdom was plainly discouraged from the get-go. A primordial ground rule is reaffirmed in no uncertain terms by the Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy 2:11-15. This is Paul's take on the Genesis narrative according to the King James Bible, just in case there was any doubt. Verse 15 of the King James Version sounds awfully like a threat to any woman considering straying from her domestic role.
Let the woman learn in silence with all subjection. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. For Adam was first formed, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression. Notwithstanding she shall be saved in childbearing, if they continue in faith and charity and holiness with sobriety. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 11-15.
Some theologians, of a liberal persuasion, may argue that this passage is oft taken out of context, hoping perhaps to salvage some biblical respect from feminists while simultaneously fending off conservative Christians. Surely, though, it is the book of Genesis and the creation myth that actually sets the context. It is the defining mythological archetype of the universal man-woman relationship that Paul is espousing. Could this cultural statement regarding gender roles fail to be any more explicit? Hecate, the wife of King Priam of Troy, had 19 children, including the warriors Paris and Hector, who were immortalized in the Iliad. 2 of her younger children, the twins, Cassandra and Helenus, also featured as adults in the epic. The myth of their birth and childhood, however, is of particular interest.
At their birthday feast, celebrated in the sanctuary of Thymbrian Apollo, they grew tired of play and fell asleep in a corner, while their forgetful parents, who had drunk too much wine, staggered home without them. When Hecate returned to the temple, she found the sacred serpents licking the children's ears and screamed for terror. The serpents at once disappeared into a pile of laurel boughs, but from that hour both Cassandra and Helenus possessed the gift of prophecy.
Cassandra, the prophetess, matured into a woman of rare beauty but was cursed by Apollo, who piqued at having to make do with a kiss when his lusty advances were not fully accommodated, spat into her mouth, spitefully dooming all her prophecies thereafter to go unheeded despite their veracity. Tragedy befell those who failed to heed Cassandra, in contrast to the Judeo-Christian world, in which tragedy befell those who heeded the Pythoness. This is an important distinction. Christeva provides a deeper interpretation of the ethical tension between paganism and monotheism.
In other words, the place and law of the one, God, do not exist without a series of separations that are oral, corporeal, or even more generally material, and in the last analysis relating to fusion with the mother. The pure-impure mechanism testifies to the harsh combat Judaism, in order to constitute itself, must wage against paganism and its maternal cults.